Hello, Bay Ridge. Welcome to another edition of After Hours. This is our first one here in 2022, and glad to be able to get back together again. I'm going to develop and expand just a little bit and remind us of a few things from the teaching this morning, where we were talking about Jesus and why he had to be fully human to be our Redeemer. Question 22 of our catechism says, why must the Redeemer be truly human? And the answer is the Redeemer must be truly human so that he might fulfill humanity's obligations to God by completely obeying God's law and suffering and dying for human disobedience. So we notice there that it's saying Jesus is truly and fully human, but there's two parts of that. There's fulfilling God's law and there's suffering and dying for human disobedience. And those two parts are sometimes referred to by theologians as the active and the passive obedience of Christ. And actually his active obedience includes his whole life and his death on the cross, and his passive obedience includes his suffering during his life as well as his death on the cross. But it's important for us to keep these things in mind. You can't just break them down that way, but they are really important to understand the two aspects. The passive obedience of Christ does refer to Jesus's suffering in our behalf, in our place. And that includes, again, throughout his life. You know, we read that Jesus is a man who's familiar with sorrows. We know that he's bearing our grief and pain throughout our lives. And then that culminates in the cross, that all of the effects of sin that bring grief and pain and sorrow and suffering are borne by Christ throughout his life, and again culminating in the cross to bear our penalty in our place. But the second part, which we talk about much less often, is the active obedience of Christ. And I tried to speak to that a little bit on Sunday, but I want to remind us what that means and what happens. Active obedience refers to Jesus's perfect obedience to God's law and God's will throughout his life. And that includes even, his prayer on the night that he's betrayed, where he says, Lord, if there's any way, take this cup from me, nevertheless, not what I will, Father, but what you will. That is still part of his active obedience, even though it's leading to him going to the cross. But that active obedience is really seen throughout Jesus's life. In Psalm 40, which is quoted in the book of Hebrews, and attributed to Jesus, it says, here I am, I have come to do your will, O God. You've prepared a body for me and I've come to do your will. Again, not just in the cross, but to actively obey the law of God. In Galatians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul writes that when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under law, to redeem those who are under the law so that we might receive the full inheritance rights as sons. So notice that Jesus comes forth and he is under law because Jesus is keeping the law of God for us in our place. So we oftentimes speak of the importance of the death of Christ for our salvation, and it is important. I don't want to minimize that. But his whole life is for our salvation. Jesus' entire incarnation is for us and for our salvation. And this is so important for us to grasp. It is critical that Christians learn to think not only of the passive obedience of Christ, but of the active obedience of Christ. Because I remind us, of several things. Number one, this explains why Jesus lived for 33 years. The 33 years are not just a holding pattern. They are important. They are part of our salvation because he is keeping the law of God. He's keeping it so perfectly. When his accusers are angry with him, he can say, who among you can accuse me of sin? And, let the first one without sin cast the stone. Jesus is making a distinction between himself and sinful humanity, that he kept the law of God perfectly. And that's his active obedience for us. And that was necessary for us because we had to keep God's covenant law. And Jesus did it in our behalf. We get sloppy in our culture and act like, well, it doesn't really matter if we do that. Yes, it does. We were under covenant obligation with God from our creation, from the garden forward, and none of that is set aside. Theologians again will speak of the covenant of works, or the Adamic covenant, the covenant of creation. There are various ways that it's spoken about, but note that Christ comes and fulfills that covenant for us. That's that doctrine of the second Adam. He did this. And so it's essential to understand this active obedience is critical to Jesus being the second Adam. The second Adam isn't just a doctrine about dying, it's a doctrine about living. It's a doctrine about fulfilling what God has called humanity to do. And again, if you meditate in 1 Corinthians 15, in Romans chapter 5, if you look in Hebrews chapter 2, and there are other places where it comes up, but these tie together the scripture. And that's why when we get to Revelation 21 and 22, so many of the images are right back in Genesis 1 and 2, because Christ has fulfilled the call for us as human beings, and now we are carrying forward with what God's original intent was. And all of this is brought to us not only by the passive obedience, but by the active obedience of Christ. And again, I remind us, fourthly, that it provides true righteousness for us. Christian, hear me. You stand before God, not negatively, not neutrally, but positively, standing before Him as bearing righteousness because of what Jesus Christ has done. And not just righteousness that is some kind of a fiction, but know that Christ has earned covenant righteousness. He has obeyed the covenant in our place, and that righteousness is given to us. So for all of these reasons, explaining why Jesus died and fulfilling God's covenant law and the ministry of the second Adam and giving positive righteousness to us, being imputed to us, understanding all of this is a firm anchor for our soul. One great theologian early in the 20th century was J. Gresham Machen. He helped found Westminster Theological Seminary, wrote a number of very important works. Christianity and Liberalism, I've mentioned before, but did a great work on the virgin birth. But Machen died unexpectedly as still a fairly young man. And when he was dying, he sent off a final telegram to one of the other seminary professors. And in his final telegram, he said this: "I'm so thankful for the active obedience of Christ. No hope without it." Notice Machen was saying it's not just, generically, I'm thankful for Christ. He is. It's not just that I'm thankful for Christ's obedience. He is. And it's not that I'm thankful for Christ's passive obedience that He died on the cross. Notice as he's about to be ushered into eternity, he knows he's dying. He's going to stand before God. He zeroes in and says, I'm so thankful for the active obedience of Christ. There would be no hope because I'm going to stand before God, not just cleansed of my past sins, not just having been forgiven for those, but actively covered in the active obedience and righteousness of Jesus Christ. Friends, that is a firm anchor for our soul. And I hope it encourages you. And when you need help, flee to the throne of grace to receive help and confidence in your hour of need. You have access to God because not only of Christ's passive obedience that has removed your sin and its stain, but His active obedience that has covered you in righteousness, that makes you a joint heir, that gives you full access boldly to our great God. I hope this encourages you this week. I look forward to us gathering again this Sunday as we'll continue to break down some more in our catechism regarding what it means that Christ is our Redeemer. God bless. I'll see you later.